Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast, third season. My loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. This is an amazing episode because Matt and Brennan Wagner board the mothership to discuss Grendel, Devil's Crucible-Defiance. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Matt and Brennan. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
You bet, man. Thanks for having us. Glad to be here.
It's totally my honor. Thank you guys so much for doing this for me. I love Grendel, so thank you for coming on the show. I always start off with a question of inspiration. So, what inspired your love for comics and who your earliest influences?
Well, since I age before beauty, I'll go first. I was I was a only child, and my mom was an English teacher. So she always encouraged me to read, and I like to draw to entertain myself because we didn't have a lot of video entertainment back in those days.
Hmm.
And unlike a lot of English teachers of her generation, she didn't mind that I was reading comics. Um, she thought I'd grow out of them, and instead I grew into them. And just kept at it, and ultimately ended up at an art school in Philadelphia, and I met the guys that formed my initial publishing company, and we just went from there. You know, it was in the age when the beginning of the independent age, and doing comics outside of the big two studio system seemed the way to go, and you could own your own intellectual property, and was real kind of punk rock, do it yourself sort of aesthetic, and so we went from there. But my early influences were all over the board. I read all sorts of stuff. In hindsight, at this stage in my career, I think I point distinctly to so far as my art style goes and my method of storytelling, specifically C.C. Beck. I just always loved when DC launched Shazam, the relaunch of Captain Marvel in the 70s. I love this absolute simplicity and yet the kind of muscular nature of his drawing, and Joe Kubert's Run on Tarzan, huge influence on me as far as storytelling. He taught me how to move a story, when to get big, when to get small, when to get simple, when to get complex, and how you didn't need all that shit in every single panel. Um, so those two influences were big. As far as the specifically the gestation and origin of Grendel, I read a book back when I was in junior high school called Grendel by an author named John Gardner, and it was the familiar story of Beowulf, but told from the point of view of the monster, told sympathetic to the monster, whereas Beowulf was this, savage, marauding Viking badass, and the monster just kind of wanted to be left alone in his swamp. And then shortly after that, I discovered the works of Michael Moorcock, specifically Elric. Was the first major anti-hero I'd ever read. Elric's was this just fascinating, captivating, charismatic character, and yet he did a whole lot of horrible shit. He did a lot of bad stuff. He ultimately ends up killing almost anybody he ever loved, and that really kind of threw me for a loop when I was at a certain age, just kind of getting past my initial fascination with heroics. When you look around the world when you're young, the Superman and Batman and superheroes really appeal to you because you want a delivery, a messianic figure like that to come and right the wrongs of the world. Then you get a little older and you realize, hey, nobody's doing that. The bad guys often get away with it. And so that really had a big influence on me.
How about you, Brennan?
Well, this is going to come as no surprise, but my influences come funneled from this guy over here. Growing up in his house and spending a lot of time hanging around his studio and reading hand-me-down comics. My influences are his influences. But I was also raised in the age of TV, so I was born in 1990, so a lot of anime influence back then. And it's funny, I'm not that into anime anymore. But it was definitely
No, but
very
Dragon
creepy.
Ball ruled your world at one point.
Yep, Dragon Ball Z, that was everything for us when we were at a certain age. You know, it was really violent and like accessible for a young kid to run home from school off the school bus and turn on Cartoon Network, and there were guys blasting holes through each other. And you know, growing up reading Grendel and stuff, it all just appealed to me. I've always had a fascination with violence, violent fiction. One of my first favorite films of all time was Kill Bill, which Pop, you took me to at a pretty formidable age there. Yeah.
He came out of the first Kill Bill and his eyes were just big and wide, and he went, "That was awesome." And I said, "Yeah, don't tell your mother anything about this."
Must have been like 12 or 13 or something like that. I was pretty young. But these days, my influences are mostly books. I do a lot of Audible listening, so I get a lot of my storytelling that way. I don't read as many comics as I wish I did. So I get a lot of my sort of storytelling these days intravenous via Audible.
So I read an interview, Brennan, that you said in your young teens, you first read Grendel, your father's Grendel series. How did that series influence you as a creative, as a colorist? What did you learn about how to use color to tell a story by reading what was in older Grendel comics?
Well, so both Grendel and Mage had a profound impact on me when I was younger. Not only did I suddenly realize that, oh, a human being actually makes this stuff, like a real tangible person that I can see do it with my own two eyes. You know, at a certain point, when you're young, you think this stuff just falls from the heavens or something. Like it's hard to even fathom that somebody can create this stuff just from their head. But Grendel really taught me color wise how to utilize minimal coloring, especially that simple black, white, and red palette. And then conversely, Mage gave me a love of like lush watercolor backgrounds and such. And I tend to go more in that realm. But these days I'm doing a lot of that sort of minimal key saturated color palette stuff. And of course, I didn't grow up thinking I would become a colorist. Coloring just kind of fell into my lap, being born and raised in this industry and going to conventions from such a young age. Of course, I grew up drawing and making my own stuff. So the coloring gig just kind of happened, and then it snowballed from there. And now I've been doing it professionally for 14 years. So the coloring thing, I think the biggest influence on being a good colorist is knowing how to draw and paint first and foremost, knowing form, knowing light. That stuff really helps dictate good color choices, good storytelling choices in the color.
You know, I think the colorist is an often underappreciated profession in comics. I think there's
I would agree.
yeah, so I think a lot of people just kind of assume like, of course that is red, and of course that's what how you would color this image or that panel. But there's a lot more that goes into the decisions you're making as a colorist, as far as, like you said, shading, how you're determining light sources in that nature. So what did you learn about how color does tell the part of the story?
So one of the earliest lessons that I got on digitally coloring was from my father's old colorist, Dave Stewart, who everyone watching your show, I'm sure will know is the sort of preeminent scholar of comic book coloring. And he taught me some important things, but the biggest one was really pick and choose a panel on each page that you focus your coloring efforts on. That's going to draw the eye to the most important narrative impact. And then same with each panel. In each panel, there is a point of focus that is the most important part of telling the story of that moment, that panel. So it's all about reading the script is really important. It's all about knowing like what's being said and what's trying to be conveyed in each moment, instead of just looking at this page of black and white art and just kind of diving in free form. It's good to be deliberate and to have intention when you color. Yeah.
Now when you think
I want
about,
to jump in here. I want to jump
go
in
ahead.
here and can point out that, you know, when Brennan says what he learned from Dave Stewart, I just want to clarify that he actually learned that from Dave Stewart, not just looking at Dave's stuff. Dave lives here in Portland where we're at, And of course, I've worked for Dave for many years. And when Brennan first started entering the professional color field, I called Dave and said, "Hey, man, will you do me a favor and let my kid come over and just watch you and pick your brain for an afternoon?" He said, "Sure." Brennan said, "Best schooling you ever had was that one afternoon."
Well, yeah, that's probably the best way to do it, to actually learn from the individuals instead of who actually are the experts. Instead of just trying to read in a book, learn from the actual experts. Probably the way to go about doing it. Is it intimidating, Brennan, to do the colors for Grendel, knowing that someone like Stewart made a mark on it for so long? And when you're thinking about coloring, are you thinking about matching what was done or to make it yours from a coloring standpoint?
Especially with Grendel, I think my instincts are to just kind of do what Pop has been doing with Grendel for years, which is to come up with something new each time, to keep it fresh, to keep it interesting. Grendel is such an amorphous type of story. It changes so frequently. And I think that
yeah, the story tone changes, so the color approach needs to change, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just did I colored his new version of Devil by the Deed, called the Masters Edition, and for that, all black, white, and red. I still kept a pretty painterly approach to match his line art. That's the biggest thing, is each project has a different line art style, which demands a different approach to coloring. When I color my Dark Horse book that I write with Dan Scotty called St. John, Scotty's style of line work is a lot simpler than my father's, so I color it a lot simpler. I only use the round brush. I go for pretty flat, or just what we refer to as like two-tone shading. But it really depends. When I did Devil's Odyssey, that was a kaleidoscopic sort of space venture. So I went all out on that. I tried to throw everything in the kitchen sink at that to experiment and have fun. And I think it turned out. I think it reflects in the final product. It's a lot of fun, that book.
Oh, I really did love reading Devil's Odyssey. You guys did a great job with that book. So for Matt. I read an interview that you gave, and it referenced Grendel and the fact that you always wanted to create a story from the perspective of a villain. That was kind of like your inspiration for going about the book. Now, in your newer upcoming series, Grendel, Devil's Crucible-Defiance, he's going to enter a world, or Earth, that's ruled by vampire overlords. Okay.
Yep.
How does that impact how you perceive Grendel Prime, and differentiating kind of who he is as an individual from the idea of vampires, given that Grendel started off with Hunter Rose as being a villainous character, these vampires who are definitely 100% villainy?
Well, always in Grendel, we try to be very ambiguous about our main characters, certainly Hunter Rose is a villain, but he's incredibly charismatic. You really kind of like him in spite of yourself. It's kind of like Hannibal Lecter, and yet he's very dangerous. But in the futuristic scenario where we have Grendel Prime, and it's a worldwide kind of fascist dictatorship run by the Grendel Khan, and you have these warring military clans. Yeah, it's a tightrope to walk, in that they seem to be the agents of order against chaos, and yet they preserve that order by some pretty severe violence. Grendel Prime, for all of his, when we first meet him, his first directive is to save Orion Asante's heir, to protect the heir, the next Grendel Khan. But as time goes on, you come to realize really all Grendel Prime is a killing machine with a human brain, And the other thing about Grendel Prime is that he often fails. He fails a lot, His missions, in Devil's Odyssey, he has this mission to go to outer space to try and find a new home for humanity. Fails, comes back to Earth. He does, in War Child, he does end up protecting Jupiter, the heir. But Jupiter grows up to be a shitty leader, and ultimately, and when we see him in Devil Quest, he's become so disillusioned with the Grendel identity that he's going to horrible lengths to attempt to contact what he sees as the soul of Hunter Rose, you know.
Mm.
So so that's always been the case in Grendel, is to try and strike this odd balance of characters that you like and characters that you find yourself kind of rooting for,
Mm.
even though they do terrible things, as I described in the Elric books, you know. Christine Spar, she's on a path of revenge for her murdered child. Well, everybody can feel that and understand that. And yet as you watch her go, she dips further and further and further into just rage and madness.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, even you as the reader are like, "Oh shit, we're in way too deep." You know, she's not coming back from this. You know,
So,
um,
and I think,
and so
oh,
that's just a balance I've always tried to strike, and still to this day maintain. You know, that the use of violence is on one level something that has benefited mankind in many ways, and yet it's also our downfall in many ways. So we try to really not moralize about it. We try to just strike a tone and let the reader decide.
and I think what's interesting, as you mentioned, is that you described Grendel Prime as being a killing machine, and not only as a killing machine, but he does immediately go to violence as a way to solve problems. Like,
When confronted, yeah.
yeah, like the Devil's Odyssey, with the Exordium. There were many other ways he could have handled the situation, but his thought immediately goes to a violent solution.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And he didn't realize how outmatched he was at
right.
that point. Yeah, yep.
And being, like I said, being a killing machine, then you look at vampires who inherently are killing machines themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Are they a reflection of what Grendel Prime is like? I mean, because they're both basic killing machines. They're both, though, obviously, there's one slightly, Grendel Prime slightly more on the side of the angels a little bit at this moment, while the vampires, I assume, aren't.
Well, the vampires are much more. They love it. Grendel just views it as in a pragmatic sense. You know,
Hmm.
oh, this person attacked me. He gets it back hard. You know. Whereas the vampires, they love the game, they love kind of the torturous aspects of feeding, and uh, and it's just much more sensual for them. It's more mechanical for Prime.
Yeah, it's like the difference between a soldier and a psychopath.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, true.
So when you
Not that the two can't be the same. They can.
well, because of that he's a cyborg with the goal of being made for violence, does he what does he think about how that defines him as an individual? Does he view it as something that he can make a choice on, or this is literally part of his makeup?
It's part of his makeup, and he does not reflect upon it very much. It's one of the reasons that Orion chose him, is that he is just dedicated to his mission. And so, yeah, we don't have a whole lot of reflection in Grendel Prime. There's a bit at the beginning of this because when he comes back to Earth, he can't seem to find any Grendels. When he left, they were all over the goddamn place. You know, they kind of ruled the scene, and now it seems they've been exiled and verboten. Um, so he's kind of on a long-term reconnaissance mission to figure out what the hell's going on. But yeah, not a lot of self-introspection with Grendel Prime.
So when you're thinking about the new series, as you said, you change things up as you move along with the Grendel franchise over the last 42 years. And with each new iteration, you do change it all as well visually. So what were conversations like between two of you about the visual language for this distant future? Because you came from Devil's Odyssey, you have a character like Gamma, some bright coloring, things of that nature. This is obviously going seems to be more of a bleak story on Earth, 437 years in the future. So what was the discussions like about what the visual language was going to be for this series?
Brian, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can only comment really on the color. But for the and it's funny, we just had to fill out like a little questionnaire that asked this question, and I hadn't even really put it to words yet, but now I kind of have something. I was really channeling Mad Max with blood and ivy. So like Earth is overgrown, but not apocalyptic waste. So there's greenery, but there's like a real dusty sense, a really dirty, gritty feeling, especially compared to Odyssey and compared to the super deco clean look of Devil by the Deed with Hunter Rose. So for this, I was really going like Mad Max. Everything needs to feel because this is a post apocalypse apocalyptic landscape, and the one sort of juxtaposition between the sort of rundown rusty look of most of the humans is the necrolords, the vampires. They live in a very clean, silvery, dark blue kind of citadel. So there's a clear distinction of who is in power and who has sort of the highest technology, in the setup here.
That's the difference in coloring. Rendering wise, I didn't change that much. I wanted this to seem like a direct sequel to Odyssey. It seemed like we were still in the same, like it was still the same cameras following Grendel Prime around, just in a different setting.
Now, as everyone who assume these are standard vampires, which I haven't had a chance to read the story yet because it comes out in, I think, July. The standard with vampires is that they can't go out during the day. They live in a world of night. Now, being that this is a series with that kind of contrast, how different or how did you approach the concept of the separating what the day is going to be like, or the world, and making them part of the very clear part of the world, and that difference?
Well, they, as Brennan said, they're very sequestered. They have human troops that work for them that are able to go out during the day. They look different than the last time we saw the vampires, and the last time we significantly saw the vampires was in Devil's Reign, the one that Tim Sale drew that came after Warchild. And at that point, they still looked pretty human. At this point, they've devolved into something akin to a kind of a Nosferatu sort of look, hairless, big ears. I mainly distinguish between them via how they dress. They all dress very similarly, but with various different decorations and frills and stuff like that.
Kind of Cenobite-y.
Kind of Cenobite-y, yeah. Yep.
So there's a great line in issue 8 of Devil's Odyssey. I kind of want to go over it with you guys and see you to comment. This consortium states that humans have left a trail of death and destruction in our way being humans, not the consortium. The vampire existence, this is like the inevitable byproduct of the death and destruction of humanity? Is this sort of almost like a natural punishment for the crimes of humanity on the planet? How do
Not so much a punishment, it's almost more like COVID.
The COVID?
Yeah, like our shitty meddling with stuff bred something that came back to kill us,
So I mean, are they like a lesson for what we did?
At least and like COVID, everybody has to stay indoors.
I mean,
they're like they're a personification of consequence, right? I mean,
yep.
of action.
And how then you can become a slave to that,
And I really like the use of the consortium, and because I'm having read like the last series and their potential influence on the series, as basically observers, seeing, because there's still my understanding of with issue 8 is that even though this is 400 years in the future, they're still kind of keeping an eye on seeing how we're still screwing things up on Earth, as it goes along. Are they, so for what we can understand, are they still watching? And how impactful are Grendel Prime's actions on whether the consortium will eventually let humanity leave Earth and go someplace better?
Well, certainly Grendel Prime's actions through this are pretty much no different than he had done before. So it's not like he learns and grows. I should point out here that the consortium is based on is my homage to one of my favorite science fiction series, the Culture novels by Ian Banks, which is about a technologically advanced utopian society that operates on a level of technology that seems like magic, basically, that it's so sophisticated. In fact, Brennan's reading those books right now. And I've just always loved those books so much that I thought, it's time to bring Grendel Prime up against a power that makes him seem like nothing, because in every other instance, he's like just the baddest ass around, So whether the consortium is still watching, we have to assume they are. Whether they see anything different going on, we have to assume they don't.
Part of me thinking about, like I said, I haven't read that series and think about who Grendel Prime is. they're kind of held Grendel Prime up as like the example. And how screwed are humans if Grendel Prime is what they're looking at as our example of what humanity is?
Well, look around at a lot of our leaders today, and I mean, without getting too political, there's a charismatic leader on our world stage right now that I can't understand why people ascribe the qualities they ascribe to him when there's no evidence for it whatsoever. So
I, I will say, is that how you pronounce it? Is it Gamma from
Gamma
Gamma?
Gorach, yeah,
I
yeah,
will say that was one of the best. Like I imagine you would refer to as an allegory for
yeah,
other things.
yeah.
That was a perfectly positioned thing. As soon as I was reading it, it didn't take long to figure out exactly what that was referring to. I was
No.
like, pretty
Yeah, it's not subtle.
right. I think the first time I saw,
Randall's never been accused of that, so
yeah, I think
Yeah.
the first time the character was, I was like, huh. I wonder what that is. What's that did me too long going, oh, that's a very good commentary.
Yeah, I gave him a big
well,
red
I
tie.
did I did
Yeah.
have I did have the a whole storyline where the Pope was a vampire. So again, Grendel writes its satire very broad.
So the other thing to keep in mind too is that when we're thinking about Grendel, you're talking about a once again 42-year-old series. For the new series, I know there's multiple miniseries coming out. For like starting in July, and there'll be more coming after. How familiar should new readers be with the issues that have come before to understand the new one?
I mean, this is kind of the strength and the problem with Grendel is it's such a sprawling epic. You can't expect everybody to go and reread 7,000 pages worth of previous material. You hopefully inspire them to where they want to go dig that stuff up. But I try to style every storyline as if it's just starting off. You could figure it out, kind of what was going on without it, enough anyway to follow the narrative.
Hmm.
But you mentioned the other miniseries. Basically, Devil's Crucible is one 12-issue story arc. We're
Okay.
breaking that into three 4-issue storylines. So the first one is called Devil's Crucible-Defiance. That's the one that starts in July. Following that, the next 4-issue arc is called Devil's Crucible Sedition. And following that is Devil's Crucible Necrotic.
So also one thing I think was interesting as well, you talked about how the series became superhero, then became the sprawling science fiction epic. Is this next group still science fiction, or would you classify it as now as horror?
It's quite a bit of horror. There's a lot of grody shit going on. A lot of gruesome vampire stuff. But I've kind of always been a genre masher. I mean, even the very first Grendel stuff. Here you have this kind of crime noir, almost Batman slash Zorro kind of character that's a criminal, and he fights a werewolf. And similarly in Mage, is that a fantasy story or is that a superhero story?
Hmm.
It's a little bit of both. And I've never stopped um, to really try and divide those things in my mind. I just go where my impulse takes me. Not that I haven't done that in the past. For instance, Sandman Mystery Theater is very much grounded in the sort of crime noir narrative that it is. It doesn't vary away from that hardly at all. Although
Oh,
it
but
is
even it has a superhero.
it does, and it's inspired by a fantasy event. Morpheus, the Sandman, being imprisoned for 60 years is what leads Wesley Dodds to have these dreams that leads him out onto the streets at night. So yeah, there's a little bit of that in there as well. I just I don't know. I just like throwing shit in a blender and see what comes out.
So for our listeners, once again, July is a bit of a wait, but what can they look forward to in the upcoming issues of Grendel, Devil's Crucible-Defiance?
Well, I will say that there's a lot of there's some particularly cool surprises that people are going to be really shocked about. But again, as Grendel has always done, it's just kind of redefining the narrative. I mean, part of why I did Devil's Odyssey was when I came back to Grendel Prime, I felt like we had been in this world of the future. We had been with the Grendel cons and on and off Grendel Prime and the Grendel clans, the stories we did in Grendel Tales. We'd been in that narrative and that structure for a while, and I thought we need to break this up. And so that's why I sent Grendel Prime into outer space. And then when he comes back, everything's changed. Nothing, or to quote Holly Hunter from Raising Arizona, everything's changed. And that's what I just hope to continue to do with Grendel all the time. It's always been my mantra with Grendel. Never rest on your laurels, and hopefully always take the reader someplace they weren't expecting.
Like I say, it looks like a fantastic series. Like I said, the first one comes in July. I want to thank Mr. Wagner so much for coming on the show. And when you guys are ready to talk more, and Brendan, when you're able to talk about your series that you said you're working on right now, I would love to have you back on and talk more Grendel and your series, Mr. Wagner. Brendan
You
Wagner.
bet. Thanks, man.
so
Yeah,
much,
sure,
Ryan.
man. Yeah, that'd be fun.
Have a great night. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast. Please help me better the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next episode when JD Rosario boards mothership to discuss New York versus the world on Kickstarter. Till next voyage, travel on.